Does covenant theology explain the purpose of suffering? Imagine trying to understand why difficult times happen in life. Some see suffering as random, but covenant theology offers a different view rooted in God's promises. It sees suffering as part of God's plan to shape his people. This approach is based on the idea that God makes covenants or agreements with his people, both in the Old and New Testaments. These covenants show that God is actively involved in guiding his followers through trials. Suffering is not just pain without reason. It serves specific purposes within this divine relationship. One key purpose is that suffering reveals sin. When people face hardships, it often exposes pride, impatience, or doubt that might stay hidden otherwise. It acts like a spiritual mirror, showing what needs to change. This can lead to repentance and a stronger faith. Another purpose is that suffering helps develop godliness. Difficult times test our endurance and character, helping us become more like Christ in attitude and actions. It is a way God refines believers, making them more mature spiritually. Covenant theology also teaches that suffering teaches dependence on God's grace. When people realize their weakness during tough times, they are encouraged to relying more on God's strength. This reliance deepens their relationship with him and reminds them that he is always present to help. Additionally, suffering produces endurance, which then builds character and hope. The Bible describes this process clearly, showing that hope is confident because it rests on God's promises and love. Finally, covenant theology sees suffering as serving God's ultimate purposes. Even though pain can seem mysterious or painful, it is part of God's plan to bring about redemption and restoration. It is not random but directed by God's sovereignty to fulfill his promises. In the Old Testament, wisdom literature like Job and Psalms acknowledges that suffering can come from divine discipline, testing, or living in a fallen world. Job's story, for example, shows that suffering is not always punishment, but can be a way for God to reveal his sovereignty and deepen faith. In practical terms, understanding suffering this way encourages believers to see hardships as opportunities for growth. It reminds the church to support those hurting with patience and prayer. It helps believers trust God's promises even when reasons for suffering are unclear. It also redirects hearts from worldly pursuits to a focus on God's covenant faithfulness. Overall, covenant theology explains suffering as purposeful, designed by God to expose sin, cultivate godliness, teach dependence on his grace, and produce hope. It fits within the larger story of God's plan to bring his people back to himself through redemption. This view aligns with biblical wisdom that seeks meaning in suffering by trusting God's loving and sovereign purposes across both the Old and New Testaments.